An arrogant businessman ignores a little girl offering him withered flowers on the street, but days later he receives a letter that changes his life forever. Arthur, you have a daughter. What will he do when he discovers the truth? Arthur walked the streets of the city center in his impeccable suit and shiny watch, a living image of success and arrogance. To him, the hustle and bustle of the city was nothing more than background noise as he planned his next business move. The people passing by, hurried and overwhelmed with their own problems, barely existed in his world. In a corner, a girl with a dirty face and small hands held out a bouquet of wilted flowers. Her dark, deep, silent eyes followed each passerby in the hope of selling one more flower before nightfall. Sophia, barely covered in shabby clothes, was used to indifference, but something about Arthur made her insist. "Sir, a flower? Just one. It's to help my mother." Arthur didn't even stop walking. He barely looked away from her with a look of disgust. The girl's voice, soft but full of pleading, seemed like an irritating echo of his time. But something in those eyes made him slow down for a moment, as if a pang had passed through him. It was an uncomfortable sensation, but Arthur, true to his nature, shook it off like someone shooing a fly. "I don't have time for this," he muttered, quickening his pace. Sophia watched him walk away, shrugging before raising her voice again to offer flowers to other people who were also ignoring her. To her, Arthur was no different from the hundreds of faces that passed by every day. But for Arthur, that brief exchange left a concern he couldn't explain. Getting into his luxurious car, he paused for a second before starting the engine. "Why did he look at me like that?" he thought, shaking his head to dismiss the absurd idea. It wasn't the first time he had seen someone in that condition, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. In his world, such things had no place. His attention had to be on the afternoon meeting, on the numbers that couldn't fail, on the contacts he had to impress. And that's what he did, or at least he tried. That evening, in his penthouse overlooking the illuminated city, Arthur opened a bottle of expensive wine and sat on the couch. Despite his attempts to focus on the reports that filled his glass desk, the girl's eyes returned to his mind like an uncomfortable memory. He shook his head once more and turned off the lights, determined not to think about it. Little did Arthur know that that brief moment on the street was the beginning of something that would change his life forever. The sun filtered dimly through the windows of Arthur's office as he listlessly reviewed a financial report. His attention, however, was constantly interrupted by an uncomfortable feeling he could not explain. He leaned back in his leather chair, massaging his temples, when his secretary entered, as usual, with a small stack of mail. "Mr. Arthur, these arrived this morning," he said in a businesslike voice, leaving the mail on his desk before leaving. Arthur quickly flipped through the envelopes, most of them business-related, but one caught his eye. An unmarked envelope, made of yellowed paper and sealed in sloppy handwriting. He frowned and opened it reluctantly, expecting some irrelevant message or simple annoyance. Inside was a single, carefully folded sheet of paper. He opened it and read the first few words. "Arthur, you have a daughter." His heart raced, but his expression remained unyielding. He read those words again, as if he needed to confirm them. The rest of the letter was brief, with no details other than the name, Sophia. The same girl he had seen on the street the day before. For a moment, Arthur dropped the letter on the table and leaned back in his chair, as if something invisible had struck him. Ridiculous, he thought to himself, but doubt settled in his mind like a persistent shadow. The next few days were filled with an internal struggle he had never experienced before. His first reaction was disbelief. How could anyone dare send him such an absurd letter? A cheap trick, probably someone looking for money, he said, but the coincidence with the dark-eyed girl disturbed him more than he was willing to admit. Arthur decided to investigate. He hired a private detective, someone discreet and efficient. He did not share details, only demanding quick answers. While waiting for the report, his attitude became erratic. In work meetings, he would become distracted. His answers would be short, and more than once he would leave his partners looking at him in bewilderment. The night he received the call from the detective, Arthur was in his penthouse, with a glass of whiskey in his hand. The man on the other end of the line confirmed what I was afraid to hear. "Mr. Arthur, the girl's name is Sophia, and she sells flowers in the city center. There are records that indicate that her mother is Helena Martinez. It seems that you and she had a relationship a few years ago. Arthur clenched his jaw and hung up without answering. Helena, a name buried in a dark corner of his memory, associated with a time he had chosen to forget. Now it was all coming back, relentless, crashing like a tide. That night, Arthur did not sleep. He paced his spacious apartment, passing repeatedly in front of the window that looked out over the city below him. His mind was torn between denial and uncomfortable curiosity. What if it was true? What if that girl really was his daughter? Dawn found him with the letter still in his hands, and with a decision, he would face Helena. Arthur arrived at the small cafe in the center with an air of concern that he tried to hide behind his usual mask of coldness. He had been preparing for this meeting for days, but nothing prepared him for the whirlwind of emotions that awaited him. Helena, the woman who he had avoided remembering for years, was waiting for him at a table near the window. His face had changed over time, marked by lines of effort and sacrifice, but his eyes still shone with that intensity that Arthur remembered. When their eyes met, Helena held hers steady, while Arthur looked away for a brief moment. He approached with calculated steps, sat down across from her, and without beating around the bush, got straight to the point. "I got a letter," he said, taking out the envelope and placing it on the table. "It mentioned a girl named Sophia. You know something about that, right?" Helena sighed deeply, her fingers intertwined on the table as she watched him silently, weighing each word before responding. "Sophia is your daughter, Arthur," he finally said, a mixture of disapproval and weariness in his voice. "I kept this a secret for years because I knew you would never be interested." Arthur leaned forward, feeling his blood boil, though he didn't know if it was from the revelation or Helena's tone. "And you thought that was the best way to deal with this? Hiding something so important from me?" he replied, his tone hard, but with a slight hint of insecurity. Helena laughed bitterly and shook her head. "Are you seriously asking that? You always put your career first. It's always been more important to you to close a deal than to maintain a relationship. Why would I complicate my life and Sophia's by chasing a man who would never be there?" Arthur felt a sharp pain in his stomach. Helena's words had pierced him, not just because they were painful, but because he knew deep down that they held some truth. However, he was not willing to accept the blame so easily. "You had no right to make that decision for me," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Helena looked at him, her face hardened by years of fighting. "You're right. He had no right, but he also had no choice. I did my best to protect my daughter, Arthur. And if you're here now, sitting in front of me, asking about her, then maybe you finally realize that there's more to life than just your business." Silence settled between them like a third participant in the conversation. Arthur tried to process everything he had just heard. He had expected a confrontation, but he was not prepared for the weight of Helena's words or the guilt that was beginning to creep inside him. "I want to meet her," he said finally, his tone softer, almost vulnerable. Helena looked at him cautiously, as if trying to decipher whether those words were sincere. "If you really want to do this, it won't be easy. Sophia doesn't know you, and I won't let you come and go from her life as you please." Arthur nodded, accepting the challenge. For the first time in a long time, he felt that there was something more important than his pride. Arthur parked his luxury car near the square, where he had first seen Sophia. He felt the weight of each step as he approached the place where the girl was selling flowers. "I had spent days thinking about how to approach this moment, but no strategy seemed to suffice." In his hands, he carried a box carefully wrapped with a gold bow, an awkward attempt to connect with her through something tangible. Sophia was sitting by a fountain, her small hands arranging the remaining flower petals in her basket. When she saw Arthur approaching, she immediately recognized him as the man who had ignored her offer days ago. She frowned and turned her attention back to the flowers, as if she wasn't interested in what he had to say. Arthur stopped in front of her, nervously wiping his hands on his coat pockets. He wasn't used to feeling out of place, but this girl made him feel small. "Hello, Sophia," he said, his voice lower than usual. She didn't respond. She just looked at him, briefly before returning to your task. Not knowing how to continue, Arthur held out the box to her. "This is for you. I thought you would like it." Sophia looked up, eyeing the package curiously but didn't take it. Instead, she crossed her arms. "Why do you bring this to me? You're not interested in what I do. I saw it in your eyes last time." Arthur felt a pang of guilt. The clarity with which Sophia spoke, without fear or filter, disarmed him. "You're right, I was rude to you before. I'm sorry, I'm here because I want to get to know you better." Sophia looked at him, her small eyes trying to read him. He had learned to be wary of strangers, especially those who seemed too good to be true. "I don't need any gifts," he replied firmly. "I need to sell these flowers to help my mother. If you don't buy any, you can go away." Arthur swallowed hard, feeling the coldness in his daughter's words. "I've never faced such direct rejection." She placed the box on the floor next to her, but Sophia didn't even look at it. "It's okay," he finally said. "I don't want to pressure you, but I'd like to see you again if you'll let me." Sophia didn't answer. She just shrugged and went back to work. Arthur stood there for a moment longer, waiting for some gesture, but when he saw that he wouldn't receive it, he slowly turned and left. From a distance, Sophia watched him walk away. Something about the way he walked seemed less confident, less arrogant than it had the first time, but he said nothing. She leaned over the flowers, though something inside was beginning to bother her. Who was this man really? Helena closed the door behind Arthur with a sudden movement. It wasn't an expected visit, but it wasn't a surprise either. She knew he would eventually come back after that first failed attempt with Sophia. There was a mix of frustration and something deeper on Arthur's face, a wound that seemed fresh, but that she felt had been open for a long time. "How was it with Sophia?" Helena asked as she led him to the small living room of her apartment. Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around, simple but tidy, so far from the luxury he was used to. "He doesn't accept me," he said finally, his voice filled with a mixture of defeat and exasperation. "No matter what I say or do, she rejects me." Helena sighed and crossed her arms. "And what did you expect, Arthur? That you would come with an expensive gift and suddenly everything would be fine? Sophia doesn't need things. You need someone to be there, really. Something you never knew how to do." Helena's bluntness struck him like a dagger. Instinctively, he wanted to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he slumped his shoulders and sat down on the old sofa, running a hand through his hair. "How do you expect me to do that if I never knew it existed?" he asked, his tone more desperate than accusatory. Helena watched him, her gaze less severe but still watchful. "I didn't tell you because I knew how you were. Always busy, always chasing more money, more recognition. How could I trust you with a girl when you couldn't even handle a relationship?" His voice cracked slightly at the end, and he looked away to hide the emotion that was rising. Arthur hung his head, feeling a pang of guilt in his chest. I knew there was some truth to what he said. In the years they had shared, he had always prioritized his career, relegating everything else to the background. "I never thought it would be this bad," he admitted calmly, almost to himself. Helena sat in front of him, her arms still crossed, but with a more relaxed posture. "It's not about being mean, Arthur. It's about being selfish. I had to raise Sophia alone, working long hours, giving up on my dreams, while you built an empire. And yet, she never stopped smiling. She never stopped fighting. She's strong, but she's also a girl, and now you want to come into her life as if it were easy. It's not easy." Arthur nodded slowly. Helena's words were a brutal reminder of everything she had lost without even knowing it. "I want to do this right, Helena. I don't know how, but I want to try." Helena looked at him for some sign of sincerity. Finally, after a long silence, he nodded. "Okay, but understand one thing, Arthur. If you're going to commit, it's forever. You can't break his heart. He doesn't deserve that." Arthur, for the first time in years, felt the weight of royal responsibility. And even though he didn't know if he was ready, he knew he had to try. Arthur arrived at the square early that morning, dressed less ostentatiously than usual, exchanging expensive suits for a simple shirt and a discreet coat. He spent days thinking about what Helena had told him. The words of reproach continued to echo in his mind. But beyond the guilt, what now moved him was a genuine desire to meet Sophia and show her that it could be different. When he saw her, Sophia was in the same place as always, sitting near the fountain, arranging her basket of flowers. Arthur took a deep breath before approaching, this time without gifts, without material excuses, just him and his intention. "Hello, Sophia," he said in a calm, almost shy tone. The girl looked up, recognized him, and frowned slightly, but this time he didn't immediately move away. "You again?" he asked with a touch of impatience. Arthur smiled, though nervously. He pointed to the basket of flowers. "Do you mind if I help you?" Sophia looked at him suspiciously, her little eyes trying to decipher his intentions. After a few seconds of hesitation, he shrugged. "Do whatever you want, but if you don't know how to sell, don't get in my way." Arthur gave a short laugh, surprised by the girl's honesty. He sat down next to her and awkwardly began to watch her arrange the flowers. She tried to imitate him, but the flowers slipped from her hands, making Sophia laugh a little. "You have no idea what you're doing, do you?" she said, her tone almost amused. "No, none," Arthur admitted, smiling. His honesty seemed to relax Sophia a little. They spent the morning together, and although Sophia still maintained an emotional barrier, Arthur noticed small moments when she seemed less distant. He didn't talk about their relationship, didn't explain who he was. Instead, he was there, helping her sell flowers, talking about simple things like which colors the customers preferred or where the best corner was to stand. At one point, a customer bought a bouquet but left an extra flower in the basket. Arthur took it and offered it to Sophia. "It's for you," he said with a sincere smile. Sophia looked at it, as if trying to decide whether to accept it or not. Finally, she carefully picked up the flower and held it in her small hands. "Thank you," she murmured, not looking at him. It was a small word, but to Arthur it meant the beginning of something. It managed, even if just a little, to break the ice between them. At dusk, when Sophia picked up her basket to leave, Arthur also got up. "Would you like me to come back tomorrow?" he asked with a hopeful tone. Sophia looked at him for a moment and, tilting her head slightly, replied, "If you don't ruin any more flowers, I think you can come." Arthur smiled. It was a small step, but for him it was a giant leap forward. For the first time, I felt like I was on the right path. Days turned into weeks and Arthur became part of Sophia's routine. Every morning he would go to the square to help her sell flowers. Although she was still reserved, there were times when Arthur could see her smile, especially when she made mistakes or said something oddly funny. But this apparent normality was suddenly shattered on a cold, gray afternoon. Arthur had arrived as usual, but he didn't find Sophia in her usual place. She waited a few minutes, thinking that maybe she was late, but something inside her told her that something wasn't right. She decided to walk towards the worn-out building where Helena lived, a place she had only visited once. There he found Helena at the door, her face marked with concern. "What's going on? Where is Sophia?" Arthur asked, his tone more urgent than he expected. Helena looked at him, her eyes reflecting deep fear. "She is sick. She has had a high fever since last night. I don't have the money to take her to the hospital," he said, his voice breaking. Arthur didn't wait a second longer. He entered the apartment and found Sophia lying on a small bed, her face pale and covered in sweat. The girl opened her eyes weakly when she saw him. "Why are you here?" he murmured in a barely audible voice. "I'm here to help you," Arthur replied, taking her hand carefully. It broke his heart to feel how fragile he was. Without hesitation, Arthur picked her up, covered her with a blanket, and walked with Helena to his car. On the way to the hospital, Helena remained silent, but Arthur sensed her tension. Although the last few days had shown some truce between them, this crisis seemed to bring to light Helena's long-standing distrust of him. At the hospital, Arthur insisted on immediate care, covering the costs without hesitation. When the doctors admitted her, he and Helena stood in the waiting room. Helena sat in a stiff chair, hugging her arms as if trying to protect herself from the cold and uncertainty. "I've always done everything I could for her," Helena said suddenly without looking at Arthur. "And yet, I feel like it's never enough." Arthur wanted to respond, but he couldn't find the right words. Instead, he placed his hand over Helena's. A simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. Hours later, the doctor gave him encouraging news. Sophia had a serious infection, but she had arrived in time. She would recover with proper treatment. Arthur let out a sigh he hadn't known he had been holding. When they finally managed to see Sophia, she was more stable, although weak. Arthur sat down next to her bed and took her hand again. "I'm not going anywhere, Sophia," he said softly. The girl looked up at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of exhaustion and something Arthur hoped was the first glimmer of confidence. Sophia's recovery took several weeks, during which Arthur found himself faced with decisions he had never imagined. From the day she was admitted to the hospital, he was constantly present, coordinating with the doctors, making sure Helena got what she needed, and spending hours at Sophia's bedside, even when she was too weak to speak. During this time, Arthur began to notice how his absence from the office was generating gossip. Calls from his partners were piling up, his meetings were being rescheduled, and gossip in business circles suggested that something was amiss. But surprisingly, this stopped worrying him. For the first time, Arthur was prioritizing something that wasn't his career, and although he felt the weight of that choice, he also found a sense of purpose in it. One afternoon, while Sophia was sleeping, Arthur left the room and found Helena in the hallway, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed. You could see signs of tiredness on her face, but also a relief that he didn't try to hide. "You've been here this whole time," she said, breaking the silence. Arthur nodded, running his hand through his hair. "I wasn't going to leave her alone, not even for you." Helena looked at him with a mixture of skepticism and something that resembled respect. "And what are you going to do now? Go back to your life when this is all over?" he asked, his tone softer than usual, but still full of doubts. Arthur took a deep breath. He had thought about this question a lot, especially during the long nights he had sat with Sophia. He had come to a conclusion that terrified him as much as it relieved him. "I'm not going back to my old life, not in the same way." He looked at Helena, his eyes reflecting a sincerity she wasn't used to seeing in him. "I've made many selfish decisions in my life, but this won't be one of them. Sophia is my daughter, and I'll be here for her, no matter what." Helena watched him silently, as if weighing every word, searching for traces of doubt or hesitation. Finally, he nodded slightly, though his arms were still crossed in a defensive posture. "That sounds good, Arthur, but words are cheap. What matters is what you do." Arthur knew Helena was right, and he also knew that proving to her and Sophia that he was committed would require more than simple promises. Yet his determination only grew. In the days that followed, Arthur began making drastic decisions. He significantly reduced his workload, delegated important responsibilities to other trusted executives, and announced that he would be stepping away from the business for an indefinite period to focus on his family. The news was met with surprise and criticism in business circles, but Arthur paid no attention. For the first time, he didn't care what the world thought of him. When Sophia was finally discharged, Arthur was there to take her home. On the way, she looked out the window, still weak, but with a slight smile on her lips. "Thanks for staying," he murmured, barely audible. Arthur felt that those words were worth more than any recognition or contract he had ever signed in his life. Helena's small apartment was filled with renewed energy after Sophia's return. Although she still needed rest and care, her recovery brought something new, a growing connection with Arthur. Now, Arthur's visits were not tense or forced. Sophia accepted them with a mixture of curiosity and caution, and each day the barrier that separated them seemed to diminish a little more. Arthur, in turn, had changed profoundly. What was once a businessman obsessed with success was now a man willing to learn, even in the small details of everyday life. He spent hours helping Sophia with her tasks, learning from Helena how to prepare simple dishes and sharing moments that she would previously have considered insignificant. One afternoon, while Sophia was resting in her room, Helena and Arthur were in the kitchen preparing soup. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but filled with a strange calm. "I can't believe you're here doing this," Helena said suddenly, breaking the silence with a soft laugh as she watched Arthur struggling to cut carrots. Arthur smiled, looking at the knife in his hands. "Neither do I. But honestly, I wouldn't change it for anything." His tone was calm, almost reflective. Helena studied him carefully, as if trying to decipher how different this Arthur was from the man she had met years before. "You've changed a lot, Arthur, but I still have trouble trusting. I don't want Sophia to end up hurt if you decide to leave again." Arthur dropped the knife and looked her straight in the eyes. I understand, but I'm not leaving. Not from Sophia or from you. I've already wasted too much time. I'm here to stay. Helena nodded slowly, though her eyes showed a flicker of suppressed emotion. I wanted to believe him, but the years of disappointment still weighed heavily on me. Over time, Arthur's actions began to speak louder than his words. In addition to caring for Sophia, he also found ways to give back to the community. He used his influence and resources to organize support programs for single mothers and children in vulnerable situations. He began a campaign to improve conditions in the city's poorest areas, starting with the neighborhood where Helena and Sophia lived. Helena, though initially skeptical, began to see a genuine transformation in Arthur. He was no longer just the man who had once abandoned her emotionally. He was someone willing to take responsibility for his mistakes and build something new from scratch. Sophia also began to blossom in this new environment. Although she was still cautious, her smiles were more frequent and her relationship with Arthur grew stronger every day. One afternoon, while they were selling flowers together in the square, Sophia held Arthur's hand for the first time. This simple but meaningful gesture was a turning point for both of them. Arthur, Helena, and Sophia were learning to be a family, not a perfect one, but a real one. A family that, after a long time, was finding the path to love and understanding. The sun shone softly that morning as Arthur and Sophia arranged flowers in the square. They had returned to this place, not out of necessity but out of tradition. It was a symbol of where it all began, a link to their past that now united them in a special way. A few steps away, Helena watched them with a slight smile, enjoying the scene with a tranquility she had not felt for a long time. When Sophia was finally discharged, Arthur was there to take her home. On the way, she looked out the window, still weak, but with a slight smile on her lips. "Thanks for staying," he murmured, barely audible. Arthur felt that those words were worth more than any recognition or contract he had ever signed in his life. Helena's small apartment was filled with renewed energy after Sophia's return. Although she still needed rest and care, her recovery brought something new, a growing connection with Arthur. Now, Arthur's visits were not tense or forced. Sophia accepted them with a mixture of curiosity and caution, and each day the barrier that separated them seemed to diminish a little more. Arthur, in turn, had changed profoundly. What was once a businessman obsessed with success was now a man willing to learn, even in the small details of everyday life. He spent hours helping Sophia with her tasks, learning from Helena how to prepare simple dishes and sharing moments that she would previously have considered insignificant. One afternoon, while Sophia was resting in her room, Helena and Arthur were in the kitchen preparing soup. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but filled with a strange calm. "I can't believe you're here doing this," Helena said suddenly, breaking the silence with a soft laugh as she watched Arthur struggling to cut carrots. Arthur smiled, looking at the knife in his hands. "Neither do I. But honestly, I wouldn't change it for anything." His tone was calm, almost reflective. Helena studied him carefully, as if trying to decipher how different this Arthur was from the man she had met years before. "You've changed a lot, Arthur, but I still have trouble trusting. I don't want Sophia to end up hurt if you decide to leave again." Arthur dropped the knife and looked her straight in the eyes. "I understand, but I'm not leaving. Not from Sophia or from you. I've already wasted too much time. I'm here to stay." Helena nodded slowly, though her eyes showed a flicker of suppressed emotion. "I wanted to believe him, but the years of disappointment still weighed heavily on me." Over time, Arthur's actions began to speak louder than his words. In addition to caring for Sophia, he also found ways to give back to the community. He used his influence and resources to organize support programs for single mothers and children in vulnerable situations. He began a campaign to improve conditions in the city's poorest areas, starting with the neighborhood where Helena and Sophia lived. Helena, though initially skeptical, began to see a genuine transformation in Arthur. He was no longer just the man who had once abandoned her emotionally. He was someone willing to take responsibility for his mistakes and build something new from scratch. Sophia also began to blossom in this new environment. Although she was still cautious, her smiles were more frequent and her relationship with Arthur grew stronger every day. One afternoon, while they were selling flowers together in the square, Sophia held Arthur's hand for the first time. This simple but meaningful gesture was a turning point for both of them. Arthur, Helena, and Sophia were learning to be a family, not a perfect one, but a real one. A family that, after a long time, was finding the path to love and understanding. The sun shone softly that morning as Arthur and Sophia arranged flowers in the square. They had returned to this place, not out of necessity but out of tradition. It was a symbol of where it all began, a link to their past that now united them in a special way. A few steps away, Helena watched them with a slight smile, enjoying the scene with a tranquility she had not felt for a long time. When Sophia was finally discharged, Arthur was there to take her home. On the way, she looked out the window, still weak, but with a slight smile on her lips. "Thanks for staying," he murmured, barely audible. Arthur felt that those words were worth more than any recognition or contract he had ever signed in his life. Helena's small apartment was filled with renewed energy after Sophia's return. Although she still needed rest and care, her recovery brought something new, a growing connection with Arthur. Now, Arthur's visits were not tense or forced. Sophia accepted them with a mixture of curiosity and caution, and each day the barrier that separated them seemed to diminish a little more. Arthur, in turn, had changed profoundly. What was once a businessman obsessed with success was now a man willing to learn, even in the small details of everyday life. He spent hours helping Sophia with her tasks, learning from Helena how to prepare simple dishes and sharing moments that she would previously have considered insignificant. One afternoon, while Sophia was resting in her room, Helena and Arthur were in the kitchen preparing soup. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but filled with a strange calm. "I can't believe you're here doing this," Helena said suddenly, breaking the silence with a soft laugh as she watched Arthur struggling to cut carrots. Arthur smiled, looking at the knife in his hands. "Neither do I. But honestly, I wouldn't change it for anything." His tone was calm, almost reflective. Helena studied him carefully, as if trying to decipher how different this Arthur was from the man she had met years before. "You've changed a lot, Arthur, but I still have trouble trusting. I don't want Sophia to end up hurt if you decide to leave again." Arthur dropped the knife and looked her straight in the eyes. "I understand, but I'm not leaving. Not from Sophia or from you. I've already wasted too much time. I'm here to stay." Helena nodded slowly, though her eyes showed a flicker of suppressed emotion. I wanted to believe him, but the years of disappointment still weighed heavily on me. Over time, Arthur's actions began to speak louder than his words. In addition to caring for Sophia, he also found ways to give back to the community. He used his influence and resources to organize support programs for single mothers and children in vulnerable situations. "Do you think they'll sell quickly today?" Sophia asked as she arranged a bouquet with expert hands. Arthur, dressed in simple clothes and a cap that barely contained his disheveled hair, shrugged with mock seriousness. "It will depend on whether you have a good assistant. Who do you think will want to buy something for us if I keep messing up the flowers?" Sophia laughed, that sincere, carefree laugh that Arthur had come to appreciate. Every time he heard it, he felt his world become a little more complete. The relationship between the three evolved significantly. Now they were not just father, daughter, and mother. They were a family in every sense. Helena, after many years, began to trust Arthur again, allowing him a real place in their lives. In turn, Arthur learned to balance his time, dedicating less attention to business and more to what really mattered, the people he loved. That day marked something special. Arthur organized a small event in the neighborhood, a community market where residents could sell their products and share stories. It was one of many initiatives he has promoted since deciding to use his influence to help others. As I walked between the stalls holding Sophia's hand, I received friendly waves and grateful smiles. Helena joined them after a while, carrying with her a tray of cookies she had prepared. Upon arriving, Sophia ran towards her, leaving Arthur behind with a smile. "Mom, Dad said, we're going to sell all the flowers today," she said excitedly, grabbing his arm. Helena laughed and looked at Arthur, who approached with relaxed steps. "Did you say that?" Helena asked with a raised eyebrow. "Of course. Do you still doubt that?" Arthur replied with a glint of humor in his eyes. The afternoon passed between laughter, sales, and small conversations with neighbors. When the sun began to set, Arthur sat on the edge of the fountain, Sophia by his side. She looked up at the sky while holding a flower in her hand. "You know what, Dad? I'm glad you stayed," he said, his words full of sincerity. Arthur felt his heart swell. He looked at Helena, who was approaching them with the last basket of flowers, and knew that everything he had sacrificed had been worth it. He had something that all the money in the world could not buy: love, family, and a real purpose. And so, in that little corner of the city, they began a new life together. Life teaches us that true success is not measured by what we own, but by the connections we build and the decisions we make to care for the people around us. Arthur discovered that his greatest wealth was not in business, but in the love for his daughter and the change he decided to make to become a better person. What about you? What would you have done if you discovered that your life was about to change forever? Click on the video that appears on the screen to continue this exciting journey of self-knowledge and reflect on how our choices can transform our lives. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this. The next video.